Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Today we're going to start reading from the first chapter of the book, The Concept of Enlightenment, and it is one of the most important chapters, and it has three sections, and I'm going to make a video on each one of them. So without further ado, let's jump right into the text. So in this first essay, Adorno and Horkheimer they set up to explain, well, what is enlightenment, or more precisely, the concept of enlightenment. That's the title of the essay, and as a matter of fact, the first time this essay was written, it wasn't called The Concept of Enlightenment, it was called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. I mean, that's how it was published in 1944, but then they changed it to the concept of enlightenment. We already explained why the authors made those changes in the afterword, which again, if you didn't watch my video on the afterword, I recommend that you do before jumping in the main content of the book. As I explained, I'm not going to go through every single modification between the 44 version and the 47 version. I will just explain those that seem relevant or significant to me. So anyways, the point of the essay is to explain what the heck happened to enlightenment. And so right from the start, they write this. They say, enlightenment, understood in the widest sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters. Yet the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. So basically, we had a philosophy that was supposed to liberate men from fear, and we will explain what is meant by liberating people from fear. We went along with that philosophy for a few centuries, but when we get to the 20th century, well, what we find is, well, fear everywhere. The results that enlightenment promised not only did not come about, but even its goal wasn't achieved, but seemed to have achieved the complete opposite. Instead of liberating men from fear, it only created even more fear. So some people can argue that what happened wasn't enlightenment's fault, but rather how people used enlightenment, or perhaps maybe they will say that people didn't actually use any of the values of enlightenment, like what happened, the world wars, the fascism, etc., wasn't inherent to enlightenment, but was some sort of accident. If we apply real enlightenment, we don't get distracted by outside parasites, like fascism or stuff like that, and enlightenment will bring about the results that it promised. But for the authors, this is simply not understanding enlightenment. If we have an appropriate grasp of what is enlightenment, like if we grasp its concept, we will see that what happened didn't occur because of an accident, but was inherent to enlightenment and was actually coherent with it. So grasping the concept is itself a strange expression, because concepts are supposed to do the grasping. Like in German, the word for concept is Begriff, which literally means to grasp. So failing at grasping the concept of enlightenment means that we didn't grasp what grasps enlightenment. So in other words, we didn't understand how enlightenment works, or even what enlightenment is. So what is the nature of enlightenment's relationship with the world, and more specifically with those fears that it wanted to liberate us from, and perhaps even more specifically, what is enlightenment's relationship to itself? Because as we will see, there is something about enlightenment that makes it unaware or ignorant of what even enlightenment is, right? So let's start from the beginning and take something very characteristic of enlightenment to understand why enlightenment has this weird relationship with itself, where it is ignorant of itself. Because according to Adorno and Horkheimer, that's kind of what would explain what happened later. Because enlightenment didn't understand itself, that led to the results that we know of. The world wars, fascism, and even colonialism and all of that. So there is a phrase that is quite famous about enlightenment, and it was given by the sociologist Max Weber, and the authors actually use that sentence in their book. They say enlightenment's program was the disenchantment of the world. It wanted to dispel myths, to overthrow fantasy with knowledge. So disenchantment of the world means that with enlightenment, the world is no longer, well, enchanted. There is no magic, no myth, no leprechauns, no god, no angels, and not even, metaphysical concept to describe the natural world. Enlightenment is about scientific knowledge and to understand the world through rational means and not through some sort of fantasies. So mythology, all the way down to metaphysics, were thought to be just ways people who were afraid of the world came up with to deal with that hostile and unintelligible world. Men couldn't understand the world, so they made up stories. They believed in magic and metaphysics because in an attempt to explain, that world. But all of that was nonsense, according to Enlightenment, and it was supposed to stop with the arrival of the scientific method, which we often say started with the 17th philosopher Francis Bacon, who was also called the father of experimental philosophy. Experimental philosophy means that philosophy must be about empirical experimentation, like we now must understand the world through observation and experimentation. Now, Bacon thought that the old ways were keeping humans unhappy because myth, magic, metaphysics, etc. All of this, he said, stood in the way of the happy match between the mind of man and the nature of things, with the result that humanity was unable to use its knowledge for the betterment of its condition. So, happiness resides in the match between the mind and the nature of things. What this means is that you are happy when your mind understands things as they truly are. Myth, magic, all of those things are like, obstacles to that happiness. They make you afraid of going out there in the natural world and explore what it has to offer. So myth and magic, they tell us that the world is filled with dangers, with creatures that have, powers that we cannot understand, and we will always be powerless against those creatures, and therefore we must submit to those stories that keep the mind away from, going out there and explore the natural world. So as a result, we never see things as they are, and because of that, we are unhappy. We are unhappy because, well, when we don't understand the world, we cannot master it to better our living conditions. We cannot make machines that make our lives better. That would necessitate, complex thought and understanding of physics that most people would see as a heresy or sorcery back then. And therefore, we are also unhappy because we are wasting the great potential of our mind. All the things that the mind discovered before the scientific method was just, accidental. It was just random. It was all by pure luck that sometimes the mind produces something useful, giving the learning conditions of, the ancient times, right? So when your learning is based on superstition, coming to something scientific, to something very useful, would be more the credit, of luck than of, rigorous study and inquiry. As Bacon says, such inventions as had been made, Bacon cites printing, artillery, and the compass, had been arrived at more by chance than by systematic inquiry into nature. So this is what Bacon wanted. He didn't want learning and knowledge left to chance, but to become guided by systems. Knowledge needs to understand itself. It needs to build a cohesive and systematic method, a way of inquiry into nature that wasn't, random. So when knowledge becomes systematized, this is what Bacon thought, humans can finally be happy because they will be free from the hardships of nature, but also free from the tyranny of other men. Traditional societies had hierarchies in which those at the top were, fine with what they have. They benefited from that system, and plus they believed that those hierarchies were actually good, that it was, protecting everybody from the wrath of their gods or from, some bad omens or stuff like that. And as such, it was in their interests that knowledge doesn't become systemized. That way they can control knowledge. They prefer the knowledge that would allow them to be, masters over others, and these masters had both wealth and power to control knowledge, and they prefer the kind of knowledge that keep people afraid and reliant on them. So the knowledge that Bacon is talking about would be a knowledge that not only cannot be threatened by nature itself, but also cannot be controlled by neither wealth nor power. It would be, a knowledge that is accessible to everybody and make everyone able to be their own master, both socially and naturally. And so socially, men men will not have any other human master that controls their lives, and naturally men themselves will become the masters of nature. And so here's the authors quoting Bacon, so Adorno and Horkheimer quoting Bacon. Therefore, no doubt, the sovereignty of men lieth hid in knowledge, wherein many things are reserved which kings with their treasure cannot buy, nor with their force command. Their spials and intelligencers can give no news of them. Their seamen and discoverers cannot sail where they grow. Now we govern nature in opinions, but we are thrall into her in necessity. But if we would be led by her in invention, we should command her by action. But right there, the problem starts. This knowledge that Bacon describes is patriarchal in nature. You have mind that controls, exploits nature for its own benefit. It has ridden itself from superstition, but only to be able to control and disenchant nature. And so Adorno and Horkheimer say that Enlightenment conquered superstition, which I think is very appropriate as a choice of word. Like superstitions where nature's defense, and the mind comes and conquers them. It has disenchanted nature, like the things that enchanted nature were what gave nature its strength. And so this happy match is mostly going to be happy just for the mind, kind of like, in a happy match in a patriarchal society in which the happy is mostly for the guy, right? And this happiness can only be achieved through enslavement of the other, through complete surrender. So nature has to surrender to the mind, like, women have to surrender to men in order for the mind and the men to be happy. And like I said, this surrender must be complete. Like, nature cannot have anything about itself that has a trace of enchantment, right? It is denied any secrets, let's say. So the kind of knowledge we are presented with by the scientific method is limitless. Limitless not in the sense of infinite. In the book they say that knowledge has no limits, but as we will see, since it is about creating a system, technically it has limits, but it is limitless in the sense of everything must be systemized in it, like everything must be integrated within this new system of knowledge, within science. So it has limits, but because it integrates everything, there is nothing beyond its limits, so everything must be translatable, let's say, to the scientific method or to the needs of the scientific mind. And of course this also means that human society too is to be the subject of the mind. Systemic knowledge having no limits cannot just be about the natural world, but it must also be about society, about psychology, etc. So the result is that the mind of bourgeois society becomes universalized, because this is of course a model of the bourgeois mind, since it claims that it transcends myth, that it transcends all origins, all customs, etc. Therefore it can be implemented everywhere, right? And so the mind can find its happy match literally everywhere, which again makes it limitless. And this is in relation with the economic system of bourgeois society. In the text of 1944, they say it's capitalism instead of the economic system, because that's another term that they changed. So everything within not just society, but the world, but the universe, must be managed through the scientific knowledge of the mind. Like all spheres of life are modeled on it, as they write, just as it serves all the purposes of the bourgeois economy, both in factories and on the battlefield. It is at the disposal of entrepreneurs regardless of their origins. So the entrepreneur is the best illustration of the scientific mind. It obtains the purpose to transform nature and society to extract its full potential, and they can do that everywhere. You know, entrepreneurs, they can do that everywhere. No cultural boundaries, no thinking boundaries can be, you know, obstacle for the entrepreneur. They can enter any space they want and transform it, by which we mean exploit that space for their own benefits. So technology then becomes not even a means for understanding the world anymore, but for exploiting it. As they say, technology is the essence of this knowledge. It aims to produce neither concepts nor images, nor the joy of understanding, but method, exploitation of the labor of others, capital. So in the 1944 text, it's the control of foreign work instead of the exploitation of the labor of others. Anyway, so the point is that everything in nature and in society must be viewed through purely pragmatic ways, just for the happiness of the mind, a happiness that is, of course, not only abstract, not only defined from the perspective of bourgeois society and interest, but also unreflective happiness. You know, unreflective means that it doesn't think about itself. It doesn't ask itself, well, what is even this happiness, you know, or ask itself, you know, ethical questions, or even bother with metaphysics. No, it simply wants its own process to keep unfolding, and also at more efficient pace. All right, so everything must be made better. Everything, like every invention, is not an invention anymore, but making something that already exists into something better. Quote, the radio as sublimated printing press, the dive bomber as a more effective form of artillery, remote control as a more reliable compass, etc. So everything is just a matter of upgrade, a matter of let's make things even more and more comfortable. Let's find solutions to things that we already had solutions to. We will make a better solution, but you know, we are doing the same thing, but we are just only making it better. It's like technology and enlightenment is kind of like in that show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, another of my favorite shows, and I think it's in the final episode of the last season. You have the character Dennis Reynolds, and Dennis Reynolds, he wanted to take a mental health day, like a day to relax, and so he goes to rent a car because he wanted to drive to the countryside, I think. So he tries to rent a car, and then he tries to get some tea. And well, I'm going to show you, two scenes from that episode to see what happened.
This is the Suma EVS, a fully electric car with touchscreen controls, automated steering, made right here in America.
Oh, these are awesome. I've seen these. These are really cool. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, no, I accept. Oh, and I'll take those keys.
There are no keys.
Uh-huh.
There's an app.
Right. An app. Mm-hmm. Boy, I gotta tell you, I don't love that. I have a lot of apps on my phone already, and keys are sort of a system that have existed for millennia. I don't know why we're trying to fix that, but yeah, no, now we got apps. We got apps for everything, right? Even for things we already had things for. I guess since my blood pressure's going up, really spiking here, I'm gonna go with it. We're gonna download the app, right? What's one more app? The phone is the key now. Simple. It's nice. Smooth ride. It's quiet. Try this automated steering thing. Hey. Hey. That is awesome. Time to kick this mental health day off with some feel-good plant tonic. My good friend, Mr. Kratom. Stuff's gnarly as hell, though. I need some kind of a mixer. Suma, direct me to the nearest tea shop.
Rerouting to teaspoon.
Holy shit. Suma, play Roxette.
Now playing Roxette. Listen to your heart.
That is so cool. Let's just sit here and enjoy the ride, I guess. This car's nailing it.
I know there's something to
One herbal tea, please.
Which flavor?
Flavor, jasmine?
Sorry, I meant for the boba.
The little spheres of tapioca and sugar?
The tea comes with boba.
Well, it doesn't, because I see the tea right there and I see the boba over there. So why don't we just not combine them? Yeah? You know, so I'll take the tea without the covert diabetes delivery mechanism, please.
The system won't let me do that.
Okay. Yeah, no, fine. One boba, please. We'll call it a mental health day treat. Self-care, right? Isn't that what people call it whenever they need an excuse to do whatever the fuck they want?
I don't know.
Yeah, no, of course you don't. Of course you don't. One chewy sugar tea, please.
All right, you can scan the code.
Why?
Because the code takes you to the app.
That's 2 apps today. Yeah. Got apps for everything, you know? Even though I'm already talking to the person that could just take my order right here, but I got to download an app, right? How about this? I have cash. You have tea. Why don't we just streamline things?
We don't take cash, though.
Yeah. How about cards? Take cards?
Yes.
Oh, great.
But there is a $10 minimum. There's no minimum on the app, though.
Sorry, it's it's not your fault. You know, you didn't create the system. The system is just, it is what it is, and we're both victims here, so.
What?
Nothing. 2 boba teas, please.
There, like, that really is a perfect picture of what Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about here. Like, technology's purpose is just to make people more submissive, more dependent on it through the maximization of comfort. So again, remember this patriarchal image, like women lost their autonomy and freedom when they were confined to the house, the place of comfort, and men took on the tasks that are difficult and challenging. Like, just let the men do the hard manual work and you get comfort, you know, but you have to be obedient and submissive to the man. Quote, what human beings seek to learn from nature is how to use it to dominate wholly both it and human beings. Nothing else counts. So we are completely at the opposite of what Enlightenment promised. The freedom the freedom that it was going to bring turned into an instrument of domination. Anything that would, you know, threaten the process of making things more comfortable is to be destroyed. We must have results at all costs, full point. And so this leads Adorno and Horkheimer to a paradoxical conclusion. They say that Enlightenment is self-destructive. It is, you know, creating precisely what would destroy not only itself, or, you know, its ideals of progress, but even the mind. It even destroys the mind. Like, the mind turns against itself, which means that it is doing to itself a greater harm than myths were doing to the mind. If myths were, according to Enlightenment, an obstacle for the mind to discover itself and its potential, well, Enlightenment is basically preventing the mind from precisely doing that. If, you know, self-discovery or self-reflection means that we have to rethink or put on hold the process of happiness, then we must prevent the mind from doing so. And so as long as the mind is happy, in the sense as long as it is comfortable, we don't have to worry about thought. We don't have to think anymore. So in short, Enlightenment turns out to be a victim of the same problems that it identified. Quote, ruthless towards itself, the Enlightenment has eradicated the last remnant of its own self-awareness. Only thought which does violence to itself is hard enough to shatter myths. Faced by the present triumph of the factual mentality, Bacon's nominalist credo would have smacked of metaphysics and would have been convicted of the same vanity for which he criticized scholasticism. Now, nominalism is the philosophy that says that universals or abstract ideas are just, you know, conventional names that we make, we just make them up, but they don't have any correspondence in reality. They are just labels and nothing more. The only things that truly exist are physical things. So nominalism was a philosophy that originated in the 12th and 13th century. It was in the late medieval period with theologians and philosophers who were debating about, you know, what we call the problem of universals, like, do abstract objects really exist? And so so some of the philosophers were like, no, they don't. And one of them, very famous, was William of Ockham, and he is usually the figure of nominalism. And so the thesis of nominalism rendered most metaphysical discussions kind of obsolete, since metaphysics is basically about universal and abstract objects. And so everyone who engages in scholasticism, which is scholasticism is the intellectual movement of medieval metaphysics, and it was basically seen as someone, I mean, anyone who engages in scholasticism is seen as someone who is wasting not just his time, but his intellectual potential. People should just study physical things that really exist, and not metaphysical notions. So Bacon is, you know, a heir of nominalism, and also the authors bring in Martin Luther also. The Reformation of the Protestants was a nominalist movement as well. Martin Luther wanted to get rid of scholasticism, as he thought that philosophers and theologians were straying away from the actual, real, physical teaching of the Bible through their fantasies and debates about, you know, abstract objects. And so this is also true of Enlightenment. Like, the whole scientific method is based on it. But giving the results that Adorno and Horkheimer are witnessing, it seems that nominalism itself isn't that different from scholasticism and metaphysics. It too is a victim of its own ways of mystifying reality. Like, if metaphysics mystify reality through imagining, you know, things that don't exist, Enlightenment mystifies reality through its quest for power. So reality becomes just a playground for the exercise of power, and knowledge is that power. So the more I know about physical reality, the more I can control it. And so this is therefore the only purpose of knowledge. The point of knowledge is operation. It's just process. As Bacon himself writes, the true end and scope or office of knowledge does not consist in any plausible, delectable, reverent, or admired discourse, or any satisfactory arguments, but in effecting and working, and in discovery of particulars not relevant before, for the better endowment and help of human's life. There shall be neither mystery nor any desire to reveal mystery. So, like we said, nothing can be left hidden. Nothing can be, you know, mysterious anymore. Everything has to be known in order to be used. We grade people for the same purpose. We evaluate your competence, your competence at work or at school, your skills, specifically soft skills today, for the purpose of knowing how we can use you. So advertisement works just like that. It seeks your personal data, your information on social media, so that it knows how to use it to sell products, to maximize its profits. But this is not to be understood with, you know, magic and myth, like with magic. You shouldn't understand this as saying that with magic and myth things were different, that we were more tolerant or happier. As a matter of fact, the thesis of Adorno and Horkheimer isn't that myth and enlightenment are different. That would be proving that what enlightenment wants to prove actually, but rather that they are not different, that myth is not different from enlightenment. So to understand the relationship between enlightenment and myth, we need to understand its history, or rather its origins. And the origins of enlightenment actually starts in myth. So first we need to understand who is the actual enemy of enlightenment. And enlightenment set its main target to be animism. Now, animism is the projection of life or life characteristics into everything, into the world. It's to believe, for example, that rocks are alive because they are the dwelling place of spirits, for example, or that the earth, the sun, the sky, the oceans are living gods, or, you know, personified as deities. So the problem with animism is, well, that it is precisely that. It is a projection. We project our fears, desires, wishes onto external objects, and therefore we apprehend them not as they are, but as how how they are perceived from our own perspective. In other words, we need to make, you know, the world like ourselves in order to understand it. So this leads to a distortion of the nature of things, because we want or force them to be and behave like we would behave, or want them to behave. You know, we want them to behave in the ways that we want rocks to behave, right? So the most famous example of animism is what we call anthropomorphism. So anthropos in Greek means human, and morphism means to shape. So anthropomorphism means to give things that are not human the shape of humans. So the famous criticism of this comes from antiquity. We know it, for example, from the pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes, and he blamed the poets of his time for depicting the gods like humans, both physically and mentally. That was, you know, thought of as a heresy. Like, you cannot talk about the gods like they are us, you know, gods, or in the case of Xenophanes, the one God, because he believes in just one God. They must be completely other, you know, completely different from all creation. So from this, you know, language itself must get rid of all animistic influence. You know, since it is the poet who makes us believe that, you know, gods are like us, we need, you know, to be very careful about language. We should use neutral terms to talk about the world. Words with animist impressions must never be used. Impressions of animism doesn't mean a direct reference to actual animism, but even notions that would remind us of animism. So this includes everything from actual animism to metaphysics. Quote, "No difference is said to exist between the totemic animal, the dreams of the spirit seer, and the absolute idea." So the spirit seer is a reference to Immanuel Kant's criticism of another philosopher of his time called Emanuel Swedenborg. I think that's how it is pronounced, Swedenborg or Swedenborg, I'm not really sure. He did this critique in a book called Dreams of a Spirit Seer, elucidated as Dreams of Metaphysics. So Swedenborg was a polymath, like he was a very important figure in Enlightenment, but the reason why Kant criticized him is because of his theology. He claimed that, Swedenborg claimed to have seen the afterlife, what, you know, heaven and hell look like. He was basically seen as someone who has the pretension of, you know, being a seer. And Kant was basically saying that there is no difference between people who claim to be seers, people who claim to know the nature of God and angels, and metaphysicians like, for example, Leibniz or Descartes. These philosophers were rationalists, meaning that they only count on pure reason to give us knowledge, whereas Kant is saying that pure reason is just another source for superstition. Reason needs empiricism, it needs, you know, the senses, it needs the physical world in order to grasp reality. So notions like, for example, substance, modalities, qualities, hexieties, ipsieties, or even, you know, being or something like suffering, etc., like these categories were deemed kind of sterile. Science doesn't need them in order to do its thing. So the only thing that science can use from the metaphysical jargon was, you know, perhaps terms like causality. But as for everything else, it was deemed a form of idolatry. You know, so science can just use, you know, concepts like causality, but anything else like modalities, substance, etc., those are, you know, words that refer to metaphysical entities, and so we don't need them. We don't need that. Or maybe, you know, like words, for example, like quality. Like quality doesn't necessarily refer to metaphysics, but it has been used a lot in a metaphysical context. So they want to distance themselves from that. So what's the difference between the metaphysicians talking about modalities and, you know, intellicies, for example, and people worshipping statues or animal totems? For Enlightenment, there is no difference between these two, and so everything from the past was deemed primitive, animist, and even prehistoric, and it had to be discarded. So for Enlightenment men up until until they got to Enlightenment, were just replacing or integrating old myths into more modern concepts or more modern terms. Like we are just updating myth since antiquity until the 17th century, or we were disguising myth under metaphysical notions to give myth a rational form, but it is still myth. So in antiquity, it was the gods themselves who served as metaphysical categories to understand the world and even life and death. The world was created by the union of certain gods, they used to believe, or by the actions of those gods. And so these unions were made to make some sense as we start creating theogonies. Theogonies means classifications of the gods and how they become more and more personifications of natural phenomena. Like we start, for example, thinking in terms of allegories, like the story of Demeter and Persephone is an allegory for the cycle of seasons, which presents a certain order of the world. There is death and there is rebirth, some sort of balance that human beings must preserve through sacrifice, ritual and worship of those gods if they hope to survive. So from theogonies, we get cosmogonies with the pre-Socratic philosophers. Now the gods themselves become the natural elements. All of creation is itself made of elements that, like the gods, through union, they create the rest of the world, or they transform into the rest of the world. So nature, or physis in Greek, was seen as divine. It was like, nature was alive. We often think of Thales, for example, the first philosopher who formulated what we call hylozoism as the first principle of cosmogonies. Hylo means water in Greek, and zoism means, well, life. It comes from zoe, which in Greek means life. So everything comes from water in ancient myths becomes, with cosmogonies, everything is water. Okay, so Thales is known for this. Thales is known for saying that everything is water, that the whole world is actual water that just transforms into other things. And so hylozoism means that nature is alive, but also that nature is made of water that transforms itself because, well, that water is alive. So likewise for demons and spirits, they became to be rationalized as ontological entities as well. They can be studied within, this hylozoist nature. Then their ontological status became even more rationalized, that they became some sort of, pure ontological entities, completely different from actual matter. Like matter wasn't perfect because it was constantly changing and mixing, so pure entities must stay the same. All right, pure entities cannot be like matter. They cannot change, they cannot mix, they cannot decay. So they cannot change because to change means to become either better, which means that you weren't perfect before, or worse, which means that you lose perfection. And so perfect being cannot therefore become better or worse, so they must be different from the natural world. So the immortality of the gods, the fact that they don't die, meant that they cannot change, and thus that they were perfect. So they must be ontologically different from us and everything in nature. So they changed into the Platonic forms, and they became, the ideas, the famous ideas in Plato. So they govern the world below, but they are not part of it, and they do it in a very rational way and not in a random way like human beings would. These ideas were then replaced by patterns in the natural world, and we can arrive at them by studying nature, like for example Aristotle did. Hence, you have logos. Logos, like let's just translate it as reason or as rational speech. It is simply, a way to rationalize superstition, and that's precisely what Enlightenment did not want. It didn't want reason to be just rationalizing superstition. So Enlightenment didn't want to rationalize superstition. It wanted to get rid of it altogether. So the metaphysical categories were just the same as demons, the demons that people were afraid of. So to talk about metaphysics is to give to nature powers that it doesn't have, which is, the doing of irrational and scared individual. Only scared individual would would give to nature such powers. So as they write, in the authority of universal concepts, the Enlightenment detected a fear of the demons through whose effigies human beings had tried to influence nature in magic rituals. From now on, matter was finally to be controlled without the illusion of immanent powers or hidden properties. So, metaphysics, all the way down to the grossest animism, must be eradicated. But it has to be eradicated not because it is simply an obstacle to human happiness, but because it exposes Enlightenment's weakness too. Like the criterion of Enlightenment is what can be measured and calculated. If something cannot be measured or turned into an equation, it cannot be predicted. It cannot be submitted to calculation, then Enlightenment is powerless in front of it. As such, it has to throw it away. It must, see it with suspicion. But what's very troubling with Enlightenment is that once it legitimizes this suspicion, then there is no turning back. Enlightenment itself becomes unstoppable because not only it views myth and metaphysics, magic and all of that with suspicion, it also makes sure that if they want to compete with Enlightenment, like if myth and magic and all of that want to compete with Enlightenment, then they will just serve its own purpose. They will serve the purpose of Enlightenment. If Enlightenment, for example, loses a debate against metaphysics, then Enlightenment wins, right? Because what other means metaphysics can have, or myth, or even magic, to win a debate against Enlightenment if it's not the same tools of Enlightenment, right? So you are forced to admit that it is thanks to reason and to calculation and observable proof that your superstition have any worth, any truth value to them, or any use at all. But then you would need an argument, and as Adorno and Horkheimer write about myths, by being used as arguments, they are made to acknowledge the very principle of corrosive rationality of which Enlightenment stands accused. Enlightenment is totalitarian. So in short, there is no way out of Enlightenment once it is launched. Even if you want to hold to alternative modes of thinking than Enlightenment, it needs to be Enlightenment. It's like a very persistent stalker who always makes you do things on their own terms. But it's very disturbing when you also consider a footnote in that passage. They write, any intellectual resistance it encounters merely increases its strength. And you see there is a footnote there, and that footnote is a reference to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. The book refers to that famous to the famous translation by Miller. You will find it on page 331, or you can just go straight to the paragraphs that they are alluding to, which are paragraph 544 and 545. And in those passages, Hegel talks about the relation between pure insight and the naive consciousness of absolute being. Now, pure insight is enlightenment. If you want enlightenment's job towards the native conscious, the naive consciousness is to make itself conscious, like aware of itself. Naive consciousness is basically myth or superstition, and Hegel uses the image of the priest to illustrate it, like the priest isn't even aware of the absolute being that he is talking about. But the point is that pure insight is to force naive consciousness to become conscious of itself, to see itself as naive and as false insight. So if naive consciousness proves itself against pure insight, against enlightenment, it would become pure insight, and therefore it will prove pure insight's point. It will prove the point of enlightenment. Like, this is an unprecedented level of gaslight, right? If you prove me wrong, then you made my point. And this is a problem about the dialectic process itself. We've mentioned the dialectics in the introduction, and it's obviously a term that we have to unpack here. We'll come back to it many times as we go along, but for now, let's just say that the problem of the dialectic is its insistence on unity. Like the pure insight and the naive consciousness, they must arrive at a synthesis. They are forced to unite. Everything must be a synthesis, by which we mean integrated into the whole. So the point of the dialectic here is viewed as something trying to force two things into one singular unity. And this is what is so disturbing about Enlightenment, is that it is actually not aware of its own dialectical process. It doesn't see that it and myth are actually the same, but not in a good way. Like Enlightenment, the pure insight, wants myth or the naive consciousness to admit that it is enlightenment, in the sense of, once you think about yourself, you will realize that you are just like me. So just be me, just become me, right? So rather, Enlightenment and myth are the same in that they actually both aim at unity. What is ironic is that Enlightenment is aware of this when it comes to myth. As they write, according to the enlightened thinking, the multiplicity of mythical figures can be reduced to a single common denominator, the subject. Like anthropomorphism, animism, paganism, etc. All of these things are just instances of the subject trying to totalize the world by projecting itself onto that world. And so Enlightenment is supposedly about transcending this supremacy of the subject, right? But it didn't. It is as reductive as Enlightenment. It's like myth, and Adorno and Horkheimer are smart to mention the particular myth of Oedipus here. Like Oedipus, besides the whole incest and patricide story, is also known for another story. And this story is his meeting with the Sphinx, a creature that gives riddles to people, and whomever doesn't answer the riddle right gets eaten. So Oedipus is the guy who solved it, and the riddle was, what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening or at night? And the answer is, it's men. You know, when we are babies, we crawl, so we have 4 legs. When we are in the middle of our life, well, we walk on 2 legs. And then when we are old, we use a cane to walk, so we have 3 legs. Now, the answer, it is men, the authors write, is repeated indiscriminately as Enlightenment stereotyped message, whether in response to a piece of objective meaning, a schematic order, a fear of evil powers, or a hope of salvation. Like, in other words, there has to be a unity from which everything, including human beings, must derive from. In myth, that unity is the subject. In Enlightenment, it is the systemized knowledge. So this knowledge may vary on its axioms, of course. Empiricists and rationalists have their differences, but they are basically working under the same unifying structure. Like, everything must become calculable. Everything must be understood in terms of operation and processes, whether they are physical or mental, whatever. If metaphysics could become about, processes and operations, then they will be included in metaphysics will be included in the systematized knowledge. So a common way to do this is through ladders. Like, we integrate the ancient forms of knowledge within a ladder. Like, the ancient ways were seen as primitive form of knowledge that seeks to achieve what modern knowledge can arrive at. So Bacon himself thought of knowledge in this way. At the bottom of the ladder, you had simple observation, and then you move up until you arrive at a higher degree of generalized knowledge, where you can create a coherent and cohesive system of everything that you learned so far. So even if Kant, Bacon, Leibniz, Hegel, Descartes, Montesquieu, etc. were refuting one another, and each one promoting some sort of universal science, be it the una scientia universalis of Bacon, or the Mathesis universalis of Leibniz, the end goal is the same. the multiplicity of forms is reduced to position and arrangement, history to fact, things to matter. So enlightenment consists of arranging your knowledge in a systemized way, like in Bacon's ladder. The authors mention, ironically, the counter-enlightenment thinker Joseph de Maistre, who mocked Bacon's ladder. He called it an idealized ladder. And the highest idol in Bacon's ladder is formal logic. Formal logic is when you put everything into numbers, symbols, and equations. So basically, it's calculus, and it kind of proved to be quite efficient to understand the natural world, like Enlightenment wants to understand it. You know, there's an ironic resemblance again between Enlightenment's emphasis on numbers and the Platonic forms that has been, the ultimate reference in metaphysics since Plato. The forms were basically equated with numbers, but Enlightenment was like, number going to be our main bullet against superstition. We will, disenchant and demystify the world through the use of numbers. And so hence everything must follow the same pattern, the same, science, the science of numbers. It has to be applied everywhere. And again, quoting Bacon, it is not the rule. If you add like to unlike, you will always end up with unlike, an axiom of justice as well as of mathematics. And is there not a true coincidence between commutative and distributive justice and arithmetical and geometrical proportion? Bourgeois society is ruled by equivalence. It makes dissimilar things comparable by reducing them to abstract quantities. For the Enlightenment, anything which cannot be resolved into numbers and ultimately into one is illusion. And this is what was the norm of Western philosophy, of course, from the pre-Socratic philosopher like Parmenides to Bertrand Russell and the logical positivist of analytic philosophy. It is all about unity, and it is never about difference. What is different means that we cannot comprehend it within the system of knowledge. So the different must be destroyed for the sake of the same. All gods and qualities must be destroyed. But as we said, this is not a call for the return of myth and metaphysics either. Like we've pointed with Joseph de Maistre, who was mocking Bacon, formal logic is also an idol. The issue with Enlightenment is that it too is myth. Like all of the precedent rationalization of myth that became that came before Enlightenment and claimed to be Enlightenment of its time, Enlightenment itself is no different. It too is it is stained with the baggage of superstition. Like Enlightenment is also naive consciousness. So we need to talk about myth and what does it do exactly, and we will see how similar it is to Enlightenment. First, not only it is similar, but as the authors say, but the myths which fell victim to the Enlightenment were themselves its product. So, myth was the product of Enlightenment. Okay, how so? Well, let's ask the question, what is the point of myth? According to the author, the point of myth is to report events, to name things, to tell of origins. So in short, it's a story, a narrative, a record, or an explanation. But myth isn't just a record of things. It is also instruction. The things recorded in myth aren't simply explanations about the past. They're also, normative stories that teach us how to act in society and how to act with the natural world. In other words, they teach. Like myth is about teaching. So when you teach, you want to convey two things. You want the student to form in their mind a representation of what happened, and also that they become able to recreate that event. If I teach you how to make a chair, for example, then you are expected to become able to make a chair. So teaching is also about having an influence on the world or on the events in the world. So myth does that through rituals. Each ritual contains a representation of how things happen and of the specific process which is to be influenced by magic. So the first implication is that myth wasn't like Enlightenment said. It wasn't, people afraid of the natural world, but it was a narrative supposed to capture what was happening in that world and allow people to develop the skills and tools to influence that natural world for their own benefits. We will come back to the role of magic as its practice and presence slowly fades away from ritual and was, replaced in later stages of myth development. But for now, the point is that myth had already the goals that Enlightenment wanted, as rituals became more and more precise and more rational, let's say. Like magic at one point wasn't even needed anymore for rituals, since the authors write, the local spirits and demons had been replaced by heaven and its hierarchy, the incantatory practices of the magician by the carefully graduated sacrifice and the labor of enslaved men mediated by command. So by repeating again and again those practices, the practice already becomes secular. It develops hierarchies that are more and more strictly determined, like movement and labor become more organized and less random, almost automatized. Rituals are not performed by magicians anymore, but by a whole complex of organized behaviors. Like someone who loses their jobs because a machine replaced them, because a machine does it better. So by getting rid of the magician, the ritual tries to become a process in which each individual plays its part. Like magical practice still occurs, but it is incorporated within, within that rational process, which kind of, makes us wonder what makes it even magical in the first place. In other words, the ritual serves as planning, and the myth slowly turns into what the authors call a sign. Myth signifies the ritual, if you want. It can be seen in what was happening to the gods themselves. Adorno and Horkheimer refer to Homer's time, so archaic Greece, 800 BCE. By that time, in their words, the Olympian deities are no longer directly identical with elements, but signify them. So signify means that they are giving them meaning and purpose, like they direct them, or more precisely, they plan them. Like, for example, Apollo plans the course of the sun, while Zeus controls the daytime. When day arrives, it's because Zeus ordered the day to rise. So what is interesting is that in Greek mythology, the Olympian gods are not primordial beings. Like the sun, Helios, and dawn, Eos, are older than Zeus and Apollo. And in the myth, they were themselves, gods. So the sun, the sky, the earth, etc., like we said before, were themselves gods. And so gods and the elements were kind of identical. But then they had to be rationalized, and so the primordial beings, Helios and Eos, became allegories for theogonies, while the Olympian gods took on the job of being the element signs, right? So they become the quintessence of substances. They become the point of reference. Apollo becomes the point of reference of the sun, since the sun obeys Apollo. So we have therefore a split in being. According to the authors, on the one hand we have, quote, logos, which with the advance of philosophy contracts to a monad, a mere reference point, and on the other, the mass of things and creatures in the external world. So put simply, now the world is simply understood as a distinction between man, the subject, that's the reference point, and then you have everything else. So only one distinction is therefore accepted, the one between a subject and objects which have no intrinsic difference between them. So all objects are the same from the point of view of the monadic reference point. And so the authors even draw a similarity between Greek religions and Jewish tradition after After all, it is stated in the Bible about men that and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So man is giving this privileged place over all things from the Creator himself. So the ultimate reference point makes man the ultimate reference point on worldly things. So man is like a mini version of God made in his own image, right? In the image of God. So we find this also in Greek religion, as the authors quote two Greek poems. The first one is from the poet Archilochus, and the second from Solon. So first you have: O Zeus, Father Zeus, yours is the dominion of the heavens. You oversee the works of men, both the wicked and the just, and the unruly animals, you who uphold righteousness. And then you have the poem of Solon right next to it. It is so ordained that one atones at once, another later. But even should one escape the doom threatened by the gods, it will surely come to pass one day, and innocence shall expiate his deed, whether his children or a later generation. So what all of this shows, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, is that the subject's understanding of the world is that everything is about power. You know, that's how the subject understands the world. Everything is about power. All relationships are based on power and on control, and it's also based on exploitation, of course. So for there to be unity among things, there has to be command. Things are simply forced to be united. They must be commanded into harmony. And so this leads the authors to the formulation that perhaps describes Enlightenment's relationship to myth in the most accurate way, and that formulation is the following: myth becomes enlightenment and nature mere objectivity. Human beings purchase the increase in their power with estrangement from that over which it is exerted. Enlightenment stands in the same relationship to things as the dictator to human beings. He knows them to the extent that he can manipulate them. So this is another ironic twist. Like, the more human beings use their power over nature, the more estranged from nature they become. So it's very ironic, right? Like, the more you force unity, the more you standardize everything, and so the more alienated you become. And so in the same way, the more the dictator dominates his subjects, the more removed from them he becomes. And so he himself loses his own identity. Even the dictator loses his own identity in the process. Since he alienated himself from the rest of humanity, he becomes estranged from humanity. And so indeed, the issue of the book is an issue of identity. What is supposed to give identity is the thing in itself. It's a Kantian concept to talk about, things as they really are in reality. And so the thing in itself means the identity that you have independently of others, or within, equal relationships. It's what allows you to have your own particularities, your own uniqueness, so to speak. But within the paradigms of, the men of science, the men of enlightenment, nothing exists as a thing in itself. Instead, everything becomes what we call things for him, and not even a thing for itself. In philosophy, there is this distinction between the thing in itself, which means how a thing really is, and then there is the thing for itself, which is, how the thing appears to itself. But here, Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about a thing for him. It's the man of science that decides on the essence of things, and he decides on them in an identical way. For the dictator, everything has a determinate, one same identity. Everything becomes, in the words of Horkheimer and Adorno, a substrate of domination. This identity constitutes the unity of nature. So everything becomes the same for the man of science. And this is where the notion of magic gets its importance. According to the authors, when magic was a thing, this worldview wasn't really popular. Like the magic incantation, they say it differs radically from the logos. As we said, logos works as a reference point. It signifies the world, right? By which we mean that logos identifies some sort of underlying truth about the world, some sort of law to which, you know, the world must obey, and then it identifies itself with that law or with that power. Like logos becomes truth or identifies itself with the truth of the world. And so conveniently, the truth of the world is that everything is about power. So logos too must become power and dominate the world. By contrast, however, magic doesn't proclaim itself to be truth or identical to truth. Instead, magic is untruth. It is the opposite of unity. It is like its own identity is always ambivalent, always changing. It doesn't claim to perfection, for example. Like we said earlier, unity is related to perfection. What is perfect in the sense that it is unified. It is singular, monadic, and doesn't change. But magic, on the other hand, is all about change. The shaman, for example, doesn't claim to have an identity of its own independent of others, but he impersonates the world. He imitates the demons. He imitates the winds, the animals. He is like a he's like a shape-shifter, right? But as they write, he did not claim to be made in the image of the invisible power, as does civilized men, whose modest hunting ground then shrinks to the unified cosmos in which nothing exists but prey. Only when made in such an image does man attain the identity of the self, which cannot be lost in identification with the other, but takes possession of itself once and for all as an impenetrable mask. So, magic is about transformation, which means that the world is seen as an abundance of qualities. Magic allows one to experience those different qualities. One is never fully itself, but always in a relationship with others, always experiencing new qualities, always in differentiation. And so with the arrival of myth and logos, nature kind of lost its quantitative diversity. What the man of science does is subdue the abundance of qualities. Like nature becomes without qualities, just undifferentiated matter, a huge pile, you know, of goo that is just ready to be used, you know, ready for classifications. It kind of resembles what Timothy Morton said about nature in capitalism. I made 3 videos on his book Hyperobjects. You can go check them out if you have the time. And so what is very interesting about classification is that it works through genus or genius. No, it's a genus. It's genus. Okay, it works through genus. Like it puts, for example, animals into a class determined by a genus. I think that's how it's pronounced. And these classifications are kept quite distinct from one another, and each one has specimen. A cat is a specimen of its own genus, right? And you know, the word specimen is important because the authors present it as opposed to representation. So in science you have specimens. In magic, you have representations, or you have representatives, let's say. What is special about representatives is that they are specific in the sense that they represent other beings, and beings not necessarily in their genus. Genus, I think. Genus. It's not the problem, because as we said, you know, magic is about fluidity of qualities, you know, which means that a representative can possess the qualities of other things, right? So in sacrificial rituals, for example, where magic was still around, you can have substitutes. You can like sacrifice a god by sacrificing a lamb, because the lamb would be a representative of that god. And as such, the lamb isn't an exemplar of the god, but is an actual representative. Sacrificing it is like sacrificing the god. This also, you know, works when a sacrifice was to be about a human being, for example. when, you know, we use a substitute as a representative. And so this is why in voodoo, for example, it's often, you know, depicted with voodoo dolls where you can harm the doll and it's the person that can feel the pain. You know, magicians often do that. They do something to someone's spear or clothes, and it's like, you know, it's the person who gets affected by the spell or by the curse. Like, you know, things owned by someone are believed to possess the qualities of their owners. And so in that sense, they are representatives. And so this model of representation has the advantage of maintaining the uniqueness of creatures because, as we said, it's about, you know, specific things. You cannot cast a spell on someone using any piece of clock, for example. It has to be his own, you know, it has to be his clock. So magic is about, you know, the sanctity of the hic and nunc. That's Latin for here and now. It's about, you know, the uniqueness of the occasion. So even when things are exchanged, they still remain, you know, they still remain different. They still retain their own particularities. But with science, this is no longer the case. We don't have specific representations anymore, like the lamp offered as a sacrifice cannot be a god or a human being. The cloth used to cast a spell isn't, you know, the person you want to curse or whatever. Things are therefore not seen as unique anymore, but as exemplars of genus. They become, you know, disposable. They become replaceable. There's nothing special about the lamb offered to the altar, and it's just, you know, a lamb like there are many others. You know, anyone, any other lamb would do. Any other lamb would do at its place. And so you can think of how animals, for example, are being tested on in labs. Like, who cares about their suffering? There are many more animals of the same type. You can kill thousands of rabbits, blinding them as much as you want. Who cares? They will. I mean, you can breed more tomorrow. You know. So the genus is still there, right? Now, this doesn't mean that in science there is no fluidity of differences. As a matter of fact, there is more of it in science than with magic. You can argue that, but that's kind of the problem. Like, science makes differences explode, as there will always be an infinite number of ways to keep dividing the species, right? And that's what makes difference obsolete in science. Like, differences are so fluid that they don't matter anymore. It becomes, you know, the norm to be different, and what's different actually becomes the same once it is established as the norm. And so this is what they mean when they say that in science the object is petrified. Quote, because in functional science the differences are so fluid that everything is submerged in one and the same matter, the scientific object is petrified, whereas the rigid ritual of former times appears supple in its substitution of one thing for another. So all of this is to say that with magic, things didn't have a single form or relationship. That is, a relationship between a passive, meaningless object and an active subject that decides on the meaning of the things, you know. Instead, their relationships were conceived as having affinities with one another, hence the possibility for substitution, right? Like the emergence of the subject-object relationship has to be so totalitarian that it chased away any trace of magic from language. Like, the subject controls language, he becomes the authority of rational discourse, which is imposed on the object. So the subject signifies the object as it will, you know, like, I decide what the meaning of objects is. And so this reminds us of nominalism, which has, you know, an arbitrary aspect to it. You know, signs have nothing in common with their signified, you know, their object, since the signified is a physical thing, meaning that it exists, and the sign is not. You know, this means that there is no resemblance between the sign and the object, or, you know, the bearer of the sign. This is, you know, to be contrasted with magic. According to the authors, in magic there is a resemblance between the sign and their objects. The sign wasn't merely a sign, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. They write, at the magical stage, dream and image were not regarded as mere signs of things, but were linked to them by resemblance or name. The relationship was not one of intention, but of kinship. And this kinship, this relationship of affinities, imply that the way through which magic reaches its ends is through mimesis, through imitation. Things in the magical stage imitate one another. The magician, like we said, imitates the demons or the animals, even to the point of transforming into them. So the relationship model of magic is about closeness to objects, whereas in science it is about keeping your distance with objects, and that distance is maintained through thought. Like, remember that the point of enlightenment is to make sure that you don't project yourself into objects, right? For enlightenment, when you are too close to the objects, we become animists and we distort those objects, so thought keeps us at a distance from them. And we've seen what that means, right? By putting thought between us and objects, we have created a subject-object relationship. Thought has to be, everywhere, since everywhere we are surrounded by objects. Thought becomes omnipotent, it becomes kind of like God. And like God, thought has to be radically distinguished from those objects. It has to be distinguished from creation or from reality. And so that's a term that they actually use. They use the term the omnipotence of thought, and it is taken from Freud. Actually, remember Horkheimer was trained in psychoanalysis, and Freud he wrote a book called Totem and Taboo, which I actually got right here, it is the Totem et Taboo is cited in 2 footnotes, and he talks about the omnipotence of thought in the chapter Animism, Magic, and the Omnipotence of Thought. Like that's the title of the chapter. And now the term omnipotence of thought was coined by a patient of Freud, a neurotic, who believed that when he thinks about something, that thing becomes real. If he thinks of asking about the health of someone he didn't see in a while, that person would die. If he thinks about meeting someone, he's certain that he will meet them. He has, in Freud's terms, a confidence that he can control the world with his thought. Now, of course, Freud associated this with sexuality, with libido, but we don't need to go into that. What we need to keep in mind is that for Freud, this omnipotence of thought is the same thing as, magic. This is, of course, where Adorno and Horkheimer disagree. Like Freud is wrong to think that primitive men and neurotic men think alike. He thinks that what gives this confidence to control the world would be belief in magic. But for our authors, for Adorno and Horkheimer, it's not magic that gives this confidence. It is myth and enlightenment, or more precisely, it is science. As they say, the unshakable confidence in the possibility of controlling the world, which Freud anachronistically attributes to magic, applies only to the more realistic form of world domination achieved by the greater astuteness of science. So, from this omnipotence, thought becomes to look like a self-sustaining system, and becomes an ever-going process. Hence, thought is seen as autonomous, whereas the rest of the world is not. It only depends on thought to be able to do its things. So the world cannot be what it is without an autonomous thought guiding it. Even creating this world in thought's own image. So reality becomes the creation of the ego at this point. And so at the end, you have a world that is being run by some sort of big machine. Kind of like, the movie Metropolis, the 1927 movie, where you see, the workers being managed by the machines. So machines represent thought. If you look at the movie from the point of view of Adorno and Horkheimer, like industrial technology is thought concretized in reality. Its purpose is to have monopoly over reality. That's what myth and religion do as well as enlightenment. Like industrial technology and monopoly are enlightenment, and they are the goal of myth enlightenment is not the opposite of myth, it is its goal. And so the problem is that since enlightenment is monopolistic, then it needs to distinguish itself from everything else. And so it launches a never-ending process of purging the world from myth. But that's the point of myth. You know, like myth doesn't want to be myth since it is enlightenment, since it wants to be seen as enlightenment. And so in short, enlightenment is myth dismissing myth. And so once enlightenment has dispelled all of the myths, well, what is left but enlightenment itself, since enlightenment too is myth? So enlightenment will proceed into dismissing the same very things that it believes as myth, right? So the end result is that even mind and truth are nothing but myth as well. Like truth becomes an illusion, it becomes primitive, despite being the ultimate thing that enlightenment identifies with. Truth becomes another animist illusion, and that illusion has to be dispelled. And so the disenchantment of the world becomes a world without truth. So enlightenment eats itself up. Remember when we said that enlightenment was suspicious of everything that can be, you know, some sort of Trojan horse for myth and magic? Like it doesn't like metaphysics because it is just superstition disguised as reason. Well, for those who don't know what the Trojan horse was, it's a giant horse made of wood that the Greeks used to hit themselves in during the Trojan War, so during the war against Troy. So Troy was a big city on the coast of nowadays Turkey, and the Greeks they couldn't sack it because it was basically an impenetrable fortress. So they had to use tricks. You know, they use a trick to let so that the Trojan let them in. So they made a wooden horse and they hid inside of it. And the plan was to make the Trojan mistake the horse for an offering to the gods. And so that way they can get the horse inside the city. And you know, that's what happened, and that's how the Greeks won the war against Troy. So metaphysics is kind of like that. You know, it is seen as a Trojan horse. You know, like inside there is just superstition. But with what we said so far, enlightenment must turn against itself, since it is attacking everything that has an element of myth and superstition within it. Then it has to attack itself too, since we clearly now see that there is a lot of myth in enlightenment. You know, the most obvious one is that of the tragic hero. Like a tragic hero is someone who has a great potential, who has everything to be able, like he has everything above normal human beings. They are usually demigods or descended from gods, but they are fated to a horrible end. No matter how much they try to change their destiny, they will fall. And so this destined fall is also linked to a flaw in their character. They often commit hubris, which means arrogance or excessive pride, and therefore their downfall is their own punishment. So they get, you know, haunted by the Furies, the goddesses of vengeance, goddesses of retribution and of wrath. And so this myth of the tragic hero, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, is, you know, the most characteristic one of enlightenment and of the whole history of Western philosophy. Every philosophical system judges the one before it as hubristic. Enlightenment is reduced to sentencing everything before it as hubristic, as wrath against those of insufficient righteousness. The asterisk there puts it more bluntly if you read it. Like in the Italian translation, they added this note about insufficient righteousness, which takes positivism as the example of this enlightenment passing judgment on its predecessors. It reads, insufficient righteousness, allusion to the positivist charge that metaphysical philosopher lacked sufficient correctness, honesty, and uprightness, a charge generally leveled by enlightened thought against the preceding philosophical systems. So in short, enlightenment is, you know, myth judging myth. You know, it's myth telling myth. Yeah, you are being hubristic. So it hopes to escape its tragic fate by being the judge that assign the tragic fates to whomever it judges not enlightened enough or doesn't bow to its own standards. So whatever is not a fact for enlightenment must atone for its insufficient righteousness. And so the reason why you hear on the right the slogan of people like Ben Shapiro, facts don't care about your feelings, is because feelings are like myth. They are projection, they are animistic, they are like magic, and therefore they lack correctness, honesty, and righteousness. But fact itself is a myth. And so it too must be neutralized. As they say, in myths, everything that happens must atone for the fact of having happened. It is no different in enlightenment. No sooner has a fact been established than it is rendered insignificant. So here the authors have, the notion of every action equals a reaction in mind. Facts are actions, they are happening, and so for something to be a fact, it needs to occur, but for it to occur, it needs something against which to occur. So something needs to react to the action to confirm the occurring of the action. And so as such, an action becomes repeatable through reaction. We can do it against, you can only exist against something else, something that would, nullify you. You can do it again knowing that we have something against which we can confirm the existence of the action. And so what this means is that what makes existence is repetition. A fact is a fact only in the sense that we can repeat it. And so magic is also about repetition, since we said earlier it's a teaching, but magic thought that through repetition, escape from repetition is possible. Like the magician with his magic can escape the repetition. A man can become a bird instead of repeating other men. Repetition becomes comes with a difference in magic. So myth, however, shatters this belief in difference through repetition. It calls, magic an illusion, and so instead there is only repetition. Existence is nothing more but repetition. So action, reaction, action, reaction, action, reaction, etc., etc. This implacable repetition now makes human beings it makes human beings always human beings. Like we are forced to always, human beings can only repeat human beingness. They can only repeat humanness, let's say. And so it's a repetition from which there is no escape, because it is governed by some sort of law of nature. And so all of existence finds itself trapped within cycles from which there is no escape. So the law of nature have imprisoned men to always be men, to repeat being men. And so women will always be women, math will always be math. The only thing that truly exists are categories, and everything simply repeats those categories. So everything is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. So facts are rendered insignificant in the sense that they cannot escape the cycle of repetition. A fact that would claim that there is that it is not bound to repetition, for example, is a fact that commits hubris. In other words, facts cannot be unique. They can only be reproduced over and over again. And so that's what makes them facts. And so this is what the authors call the principle of immanence. Quote, the explanation of every event as repetition, which enlightenment upholds against mythical imagination, is that of myth itself. So after all, what's so different between this immanent principle, which is basically the doctrine that there is no novelty possible anymore because everything was already thought of, like everything possible to exist has already existed, all the possible combinations have already been tried. So what is the difference between this and the tragic fate of the mythical hero? So the authors they write, this barren wisdom merely reproduces the fantastic doctrine it rejects, the sanction of fate which through retribution incessantly reinstates that what always was. Whatever might be different is made the same. That is the verdict which critically sets the boundaries to possible experience. And so we arrive at a situation in which everything becomes identical to everything, which again is not to be confused with kinship. That the magician, imitates or becomes something else doesn't mean that he and the thing are identical. Being a representative doesn't mean that you are the same. Just in families, every individual is part of a family, but the members are not the same, right? When a mother loses a child, even though she has 5 or 6 other children, her pain signifies that the child that died was unique, that the kid was irreplaceable. With Enlightenment and myth, however, we get a situation of sameness, like everybody, or let's say everything becomes the same as everything. What this means is that nothing can be itself now. Everything must be identical to other things and never identical to itself. Every single individual must be someone else, must be everyone else, actually. And so the sameness is guaranteed by universal principles. It's because we are all obeying the same natural laws, for example, that we cannot be different. We must all conform to the same laws and principles. And so this may sound a little bit fair and egalitarian. After all, the old days were often marked by inequalities of treatment, so the desire of making everyone equal in front of the law may have been initiated out of a desire for justice, right? So from this, Enlightenment identified the injustice with a lack of mediated mastery. In other words, everyone makes their own laws in an arbitrary way. There is no mediation. Think about the role of the state. The role of the state is to serve as a mediator between individuals when a crime has been committed, right? It doesn't leave the issue of justice between the hands of the people involved in the crime, because it's likely to turn into a cycle of bloody vengeance. So the state would be, the master of mediation. It puts in institution justice courts, police officers who will come between the parties and mediate them towards a fair and equal sense of justice. So mediation here means impartiality, whereas in the chaotic, primitive ways, justice was unmediated, and therefore it was partial, and therefore there was no justice in primitive, stages. But then, how can justice even be impartial if nothing gets to be itself, right? If everything is identical to everything, if you hurt me, then I'm the one who should get justice, right? The act of justice must be substantive. It must be about me, the particular individual who got hurt. But if my identity is the same as everyone else, then justice itself becomes meaningless and random. When we punish a wrongdoer and give, justice to the victim, we are at best setting an example for others so that they behave, because precisely we are saying that whomever is on the side of the guilty and whomever is on the side of the victim can be anyone, but what justice really served was justice really served for the actual people involved. When you punish, when you serve justice just to set an example for others, is that justice for the person who got hurt, for example, Well, it doesn't seem to be the point of justice at all. What justice seems to be more about is making sure that no one disturbs the order of things. All it is, looking for are scapegoats. It is looking for exemplars. It is looking for, specimen of a genus. Prisons are just heads of traitors on sticks at the entrance of some sort of of barbaric tribe. It's just a way for setting examples, just like the rabbits in the lab. And so they say the identity of everything with everything is but at the cost that nothing can be the same can at the same time be identical to itself. Enlightenment dissolves away the injustice of the old inequality of unmediated mastery, but at the same time perpetuates it in universal mediation by relating every existing thing to every other. So this paradox that on the one hand, enlightenment seeks mediation to put some order into chaos, and to make sure that people are free in order, but on the other it perpetuates this chaos within its universal order. And so this is shown through the reference to the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who on the one hand was critical of enlightenment for its emphasis on the abstract and the universal, and so the loss of individuality and subjectivity, but he also praises the Protestant ethics of its time. As we've mentioned, Luther and the Reformation earlier, we've seen that Luther was like Bacon. They both embraced the idea of knowledge as power. So wanting to save the individual while simultaneously praising Protestant ethics is kind of contradictory. And so because subjectivity is incommensurable, and the Protestant ethics is kind of about fate and predestination, which means that your fate is actually commensurable, your subjectivity then too is commensurable. And so this is a tension within Kierkegaard's work, and we will talk about Kierkegaard another time. We will do some close reading on him, but for Adorno and Horkheimer, there is this paradox in Kierkegaard's thought. So the authors, they tell us that this is also myth, since it is just a reenactment of mythical violence. So here they bring in the figure of Hercules, which is the Roman name for the Greek demigod Heracles. Now Heracles is famous for his 12 labors, which basically are all about taming the forces of nature. Like killing the Nemean lion, the Hydra, the Amazons, the wild boar, and the bull, to kill some dangerous birds, and actually even taming some pretty dangerous Mars, and even Cerberus, the guard dog of the underworld. So throughout the labors, Hercules is inflicting mythical violence, which is the kind of violence that you find in myth, violence over nature to tame it, to render it inoffensive by getting rid of the incommensurable elements in nature. So the same principle is applied in myth. Subjectivity and individuality are mythical monsters that Heracles has to kill, and the Protestant ethics must subdue to fate and predestination. And so likewise, enlightenment turns subjectivity into a bunch of numbers and equations. And so enlightenment brings what Kierkegaard's Protestantism and the myth of the 12 labors are actually about. They write, the primal image of mythical force, it imputates the incommensurable. Not merely are qualities dissolved in thought, but human beings are forced into real conformity. And so this is where the discussion about markets and fascism come about. Like many liberals, for example, think that market economies are what guarantees subjectivity, right? Like the free market allows people to express themselves in the ways that they want. They can express their taste, personalities, ideas, without anyone coercing them. So liberalism is supposed to liberate the difference and uniqueness. But like we said about science, oh yeah, it does. Like it liberates difference. It liberates so much that difference becomes meaningless. And so the mythical violence that we just mentioned isn't really like in the myth where you have an actual power forcing you to be like anyone else by brute force, which is the characteristic of Hercules. By the way, he only uses brute force, but rather submission is guaranteed through the satisfaction of individuals' needs and desires. Like, advertising calculates the things about yourself to make you buy the stuff that's supposed to help you express, that wonderful personality of yours. And so by doing that, the market renders your difference commensurable, or let's say, manageable, calculable. It knows where to put you so that you can feel satisfied without, threatening the economy, without, threatening the process of production. And, if you don't comply, then liberalism will, without any hesitation, appeal to direct brute force. It will, turn into Hercules. So it will appeal to the state, to actual coercion, to physical violence. So if you don't accept to be like everyone else by embracing the identity, the difference that the market gave you, then we will release the dogs on your ass. We will send the police to your doors. And so this is what makes liberalism so vulnerable to fascism. It promotes, freedom and difference as long as we are all the same. When we hear the phrases like, we are all the same, we take it positively because we are understanding it in the terms of worth, like no individual is worth more than another. But in liberalism and in fascism, what is meant is that ontologically we are the same. Like our worth as equals means that we are replaceable. So nothing about myself as Ismail has to be taken into account. My name, my personality, my experience, etc. are all just, words and concepts. In nominalism, they don't exist. What exists is this body. It's my physical presence. And this matter is the same as yours, right? And it is the same as the soil that we exploit in agriculture. It is the same as the water that we drink and we pollute, the animals that we eat and that we test on, etc. And so human beings become a bunch of stuff. Human organic goo. That's what we are. We become a horde, if you like. And here's what they have to say about that word, the word herd. So the horde, a term which doubtless is to be found in the Hitler Youth organization, is not a relapse into the old barbarism, but the triumph of repressive égalité, the degeneration of the equality of rights into the wrong inflicted by equals. So Nazis are the natural successors of liberalism. They need a society in which the individual disappears and that place only to the horde. So we think that horde mentality is a regression. Horde or mob mentality is a regression. We even hear it today with snowflakes crying over cancel culture, for example. Like this is a return to tribalism, to barbarism, etc. But their confusion, their confused speech doesn't seem to be aware that the horde mentality is not a regression. It is the goal of progress. It is the goal of enlightenment. It's nature course. It is its natural course ever since myth was created. So there is no difference between the barbarism of primitive tribes, where, for example, retribution and punishment were distributed arbitrarily according to the subjective and emotional whims of people too dumb to understand basic physics. There is no difference between that and today's conception of justice as blindfolded lady who doesn't see on whom its punishment falls down. So whether we are living in the jungle where might makes right, or living in civilization where justice is completely abstract, you have the same result. In both cases, individuality and subjectivity are liquidated. Once you start, submitting nature to your will, human beings will soon follow. So, quote, under the leveling rule of abstraction, which makes everything in nature repeatable, and of industry, for which abstraction prepared the way, the liberated finally themselves become the herd, troop, which Hegel identified as the outcome of enlightenment. So there, Adorno and Horkheimer are referring, again, another passage from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. They are referring to paragraph 560 here, in which Hegel talks about how enlightenment is about usefulness. Like the worth of something is determined with how much useful it is, and that includes human beings, right? And through the end of the paragraph, Hegel talks about how a man can only be part of a group insofar as he uses the group and can be used by the group. Now, to be precise, in this translation, Adorno and Horkheimer, we have the term herd for Trupp, or Troop, I think that's how it is pronounced in German, but in Hegel's text, the translation is usually the term group, which is more neutral than the term, herd. But the idea The idea is that to be part of the group is determined by how we can exploit you for the benefit of the group, which is very close to an idea of herd, of the idea of a herd of sheep, right? The only value that a sheep has within the herd is to be consumed later on. Their identity as individuals has no value, in this context. When you are in a herd, you are not valuable. Your identity has no value. So the term Trupp in German needs to have the connotation of we cannot distinguish one individual from another. Like when you look at a flock of sheep, they all look alike, right? And this is the point that the authors are trying to get at, is that there is no differentiation anymore. So this leads us to the last part of the first section, which is where the authors address the concept of mana. It's a concept, it's a principle actually that you can find in Buddhism, and it is sometimes equated with hubris for the ancient Greeks, but it has distinctions worthy to be noted. We will come back to it, but first there is a little bit of context that the authors give here. Like they point to our attention that the famous hymn collections of the ancient world, notably the Homeric hymn of ancient Greece and the Rig Vedas in India, were written at a time of territorial conquest and domination. So we are talking about violent colonization of some indigenous people. And so these hymns about the divine origins of gods were certainly composed in an ideological context, with the intention of legitimizing the position of the rulers over their new acquired territory and new forms of management of resources. As they say, the hymns are about the power of all-powerful and supreme gods, which are to be seen as parallel with the powers and positions of kings. So these kings are said to tie the new subjugated people to the land through the divine genealogy that we find in myths. Or in hymns, sorry. And then they have, their doctors, they have their soothsayers, their artisans, their traders, to take care of the circulation of the new subjugated people. So what this series of conquest meant is that nomadism is gone. Like people now have to settle into organized and stratified land and can only circulate within regulated infrastructures. So the base unit of sedentary infrastructure is of course private property. Now you have your own home, the land in which you can always live, to which you can always return, and from which you can manage your environment. So property means that you are concretely a reference point. So with the arrival of private property, now we see a distinction between power and labor. So in nomadism, where people were nomads, they had to go from one place to another. There is no or almost no division of labor, but once we have settled somewhere, we become more pragmatic. Like labor is managed differently, more efficiently. Like we plan labor by dividing it, but this division implies a mind that divides labor. So power becomes what divides labor, what manages labor. Whomever owns the property decides on how to manage that property, how bodies can circulate within the owner's land. So the kings, or the basileus in Greek, in Homer, for example, do specifically that. The heroes are kings in Greek mythology, and as kings they are basically managers. Adorno and Horkheimer quote a French historian, Gustave Glutz, I think that's how it is pronounced. He's a French historian who wrote about the Odyssey, and more specifically Odysseus, the mythical hero of the Odyssey, saying that controls about Odysseus. He says this about Odysseus. He says he controls from a distance a numerous, finely graded personal of ox herds, shepherds, swineherds, and servants. In the evening, having looked out from his castle to see the countryside lit up by 1,000 fires, he can go to rest to his rest in peace. He knows that his loyal servants are watching to keep away wild animals and to drive away thieves from the enclosures which they are there to protect. So to go back to the idea of truth, this entails that from now, truth means whatever works in increasing your power over the world. Like knowledge is power means precisely that. You can organize the world in such a way that the world now works on its own only to satisfy your own needs. So in order to obtain that organization, the one described in Odysseus, you need to classify things, and the more they are classified, the greater the distance between the objects of classification, like the more the distance between the object of classification grows, as well as the distance between the subject and the object. So you need to have greater distance between, for example, the classes, between like in science, for example, you need to make different classes of species, and you need to maintain them very separate from each other. And you also have the distance between the subject and the object. So the subject that is doing the classification has to be very distant from the objects, and as well the objects themselves need to be very distant from one another. So the greater the distance, the greater the power, and as such whatever is vanquished must be kept the furthest from the ruling subject. So this explains why, for example, the old deities of the magical world are often chthonic deities, meaning deities that are related to the earth, and then they get banished to the deeper parts of the earth, to hell, to Tartarus, by the new gods, which are often depicted as sky gods. And so this serves as establishing a never reachable distance between them, not only, physically, but even conceptually. So sky gods such as Zeus for the Greeks, or as Indra in Hinduism, are equated with vision, with light and the sun, whereas, the vanquished chthonic gods are equated with blindness and darkness. So this serves as a symbol for banishing the past once it is conquered, and to make sure that the indigenous, with their local and superstitious tradition, can never resurface, right? But this would imply a flaw in thought. If it banishes those superstitions, then it would admit that something exists beyond it. And as we've said, thought is supposed to be limitless. As such, superstition must be manageable as well, like subjectivity and individuality. So the banishment cannot be a radical exclusion, but more like turning the banished subject into an inoffensive subject, something that can be integrated within the system of thought and turned into something useful for it. So the distinction between heaven and hell wasn't that rigid. As a matter of fact, for a long time, heaven and hell maintained a connection. Even the name Zeus could be applied to a god of the underworld. So hell must also be governed by Zeus and not just ignored by Zeus. Hence, light and darkness, good and evil, holy and unholy, need to maintain a dialectical relationship, like summer and winter, like life or death, and therefore were not unambiguously distinguished, as they say. The fact that for thought the world seems to work through opposites seems to imply that the unity of the world must include and interplay a co-dependence of opposites. So opposition, therefore, is the prerequisite for unity. And this is where the concept of mana comes in. As they write, the murky, undivided entity worshipped as the principle of mana at the earliest stages of humanity lived on in the bright world of the Greek religion. Primal and undifferentiated, it is everything known and alien. It is that which transcends the bounds of experience, the part of things which is more than their immediate perceived existence. So in Greek mythology, mana is like chaos. Chaos is like the primordial being from which all other gods emerge. Chaos is undistinguished, undivided, undifferentiated matter that then starts to be classified. It starts to be classified as Pontus, for example, the sea god, and Gaia, the earth goddess, and these two emerge from chaos, and from Gaia there is Uranus, the sky, who emerges from Gaia. So chaos becomes to be organized through classification, right? Now, mana works like that. It is experienced when those classifications lose their limits or kind of become blurry, and the undivided murky stuff re-emerges. So chaos comes back in mana. So according to Adorno and Horkheimer, this is the meaning of supernatural experience in primitive contexts. It is not, a discovery of a spiritual substance as, opposed to a material substance. Rather, the supernatural is the realization of the, concatenation of nature, the fact that everything is connected. But mana isn't myth yet, since it corresponds to the earlier stages of humanity. So the stage that is least familiar with myth and enlightenment. In mana, the relation between opposites, like generation and destruction, doesn't provoke the same kind of reaction in the primitive man than in the man of enlightenment. The former doesn't really seek to totalize this relationship into a system of logic, whereas the later does. Enlightenment tries to make sense of this relation, whereas the primitive man doesn't. The way primitive man experiences mana is through fear, precisely, which is precisely what the man of science wants to get rid of. So mana, when experienced, doesn't deliver any knowledge about the world in order to better control it. It is simply a reflex, a reaction, as we say. In other words, mana is admitting that one doesn't know about the world, that the world is truly unfamiliar, and we submit to that unknown. Enlightenment, by saying that the primitive man fears the unknown or the unfamiliar, seeks to turn the unknown into the known, the unfamiliar into the familiar, the different to the same, the living to the non-living, right? And so this is exactly the paradox of enlightenment. By differentiating things through classification, it makes everything the same. While in mana, by getting rid of differentiation, it maintains difference. And so things would therefore exist in a relation of unfamiliarity, as the unknown always transcends the known. And as such, the project of enlightenment, which was, accusing primitive people of being afraid of the unknown, and they believed in magic out of a desire to control the world and stuff, is itself accused of being afraid of the unknown. Enlightenment is also afraid of the unknown, and try perhaps even more than ever, than any other primitive society, to control that unknown. So since the categories that are present in myth are also present in mana, the man of enlightenment is just trying to make himself unafraid of them. Hence its desire to make everything useful for the mind. And so the mind can only be happy if everything is familiar to it. So all of dualities within modernity are actually stemming from that original fear. As they say, the doubling of nature into appearance and essence, effect and force, made possible by myth no less than by science, spring from human fear, the expression of which becomes its explanation. But this doesn't mean that everything is a projection, of course. If enlightenment accuses animism, magic, and myth to be projection of mind and soul onto nature, and we learn that enlightenment is no more different than that, it doesn't mean that we are animists, whether we are magicians or men of science. The fact that enlightenment turns out to be acting like mana, like it is not afraid doesn't prove the thesis of psychologism, which is the idea that everything about the world is a product or a projection of the psyche. We are not transposing the soul into nature. Rather, it's the opposite. Mana is not a transposition of the soul into nature, but a transposition of nature into the soul. So here's a quote: "Mana, the moving spirit, is not a projection but the echo of the real preponderance of nature in the weak psyches of primitive people." So what this means is that the mind of primitive people was weak to resist to the invading presence of nature, even within their own minds. They are just affected by nature without being able to reflect on what is really happening to them. They indeed feel themselves powerless in front of nature. If they experience mana as they are close to nature, that's because nature is very murky. It is constantly transforming everything, kind of like magic. So in other words, people didn't have to be animist to believe that some sites are sacred while others are profane, for example. They didn't have to be animists to believe in spirits inhabiting the world or demons riding on the winds. So the division between animate and non-animate, the sacred versus the sacred versus the profane, the subject and the object, existed already in pre-animism. They just neither have the fixed identity that Enlightenment forces them to have, nor the same identity as everything else. Things were simultaneously others and also themselves. Quote, if the tree is addressed no longer as simply a tree but as evidence of something else, a location of mana, language expresses the contradiction that it is at the same time itself and something other than itself, identical and not identical. So there's a footnote there that we should look at. It's a reference to the sociologist Marcel Mauss and Henri Hubert and on their work on magic. The note reads, Hubert and Mauss describe the nature of sympathy or mimesis as follows. L'un est le tout est dans l'un, la nature triomphe dans la nature. This means the one is everything, everything is in the one, nature triumphs over nature. So this is indeed very similar to the dialectic. One can say that this is weird because mana sounds pretty totalizing. I mean the one is everything, everything is the one, nature triumphs over nature. Doesn't this mean that everything is the same in nature? And if so, in what ways mana is different from enlightenment? Well, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, it is true that mana is dialectical, but as they say, the problem with dialectics is only when it becomes systematizing. So even if within mana prefigure the elements of dialectics, it doesn't raise any problem since the fear is admitted. As they say, this dialectic remains powerless as long as it emerges from the cry of terror, which is the doubling, the mere tautology of terror itself. The gods cannot take away fear from human beings, the petrified cries of whom they bear as their names. Humans believe themselves free of fear when there is no longer anything unknown. So, as long as fear exists and is acknowledged, the dialectic process doesn't turn into a totalizing process. This doesn't also mean that within enlightenment there is no fear. We're not saying that we are in front of a dilemma where we have to choose between fear but you have freedom and an absence of fear but you have tyranny. For Adorno and Horkheimer, there is no such thing as an absence of fear. Like enlightenment, by trying to get rid of fear by making everything known, simply radicalizes fear. Like fear becomes everywhere now, whereas in primitive society, fear was only limited to mana, and mana was limited to specific locations, to wherever magic occurs. So what is meant by this is that since everything must become knowable, then as we said earlier, there cannot be any outside the system of knowledge anymore. Like the unknowable, which is the source of fear, would therefore cease to exist. But the unknowable doesn't cease to exist simply because positivism says so, right? So where does the unknown go? Where does the unknowable, the uncontrollable, the unfamiliar, where do all of these things go? Well, it simply fights back, actually. As you try to make everything knowable, the unknowable will permeate all things. Like the outside spreads within the inside, and therefore fear takes on everything. So what enlightenment has succeeded in is not the liberation of humans from fear, but the radical spread of fear. So now mana actually becomes everywhere. The shift from the magical stage within the magical, the shift from the magical into the mythical stage is that everything now becomes mana. Everything is reacted to with fear. And so Adorno and Horkheimer give the example of how some ancient societies have this tradition of admitting within their families the murder of, one of their members. So the murderer is, for example, absorbed into the blood of the family, and this is a metaphor to illustrate how we live in something like that, like there is no outside the family. So that even when something harms the family, it must be absorbed into it. And so this is, they say, the establishment of immanence. It is the characteristic of a world of myth. Quote, the mythical dualism does not lead outside the circle of existence. The world controlled by mana and even the worlds of Indian and Greek myths are issueless and eternally the same. All birth is paid for with death, all fortune with misfortune. So this is the highest form of fatalism, the idea that no one can escape their fate. However, we fight no matter what we do, regardless of how great our feats can be, no matter how fortunate we are, there is always a bad end at store for us. There is no way out of this. And so this is the law of equivalence, the ultimate law of myth and of enlightenment. What makes justice is to what extent something obeys to the law of equivalence. So this means that things must always be able to be written in the form of an equation. Everything has something equal to it. It is no coincidence that besides the blindfold, justice also has a scale, right? Whatever you put on one scale, you must put something equivalent on the other. Otherwise, you just lead to imbalance, and imbalance is injustice. So guilt must have atonement, happiness must have misfortune, and on the other side of the equation. And so justice, they say, can only be that of a deeply oppressive and impoverished society, one that has no way of escaping from its fate. Hence, once it starts dominating nature, it cannot help but dominate itself and therefore return to nature. So the only way for the dominant to be just is by returning as a dominant to its own dominated state. So society tries to escape the dominance of nature by becoming nature, and it's now dominating its own members. Since there is no escape from nature, there is no escape from society either. Just like all the symbols of myths refer to the inescapable condition of nature, whether the duality of the Gemini constellation, the cosmic egg from which everything in the world springs from, the scales held by Zeus, social laws are modeled on this cosmic fatality in the natural laws. So the law of equivalence turns into a fetish, which, if you remember, in Marxism, a fetish means something that hides the history of society. We take the way that we live now as natural and therefore as inevitable, instead of seeing it as a social construction that has a history behind it. So equivalence turns into a fetish that hides from us the power relations on which society is built and on which society is maintained. As they say, earlier fetishes had been subject to the law of equivalence. Now equivalence itself becomes a fetish. The blindfold over the eyes of Justitia means not only that justice brooks no interference, but that it does not originate in freedom. So indeed, we've been taking, justice as a value that originates from a desire for freedom. The justice of the enlightened, of the Enlightenment, the justice of the Enlightenment promised freedom. But once you look at its history, its dialectical process, you discover that freedom was never among its goals. And this is what it means to be a critical theorists. And this is what we are going to talk about this more in the second section. And that's it for this first section of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. I hope that this was helpful to you as you read along the book, and I will see you next week for the second section of the concept of enlightenment. And as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.